So with that, let's join together in our blessing for study, and then we'll allow Dennis to continue. Baruch
Baruch atah
Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. And I'm going to mute everybody. If you wish to be unmuted, just hit your unmute button, or if it's a quick thing, just hit and hold the space bar. And otherwise, take it away, Dennis.
Okay, I'm sharing screen, and Rabbi, do you have my presentation view of the title slide?
Okay, just 1 second. I'm going to unmute Dennis.
Okay.
And you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Does everybody have it?
No.
No. Okay, so let's go back to here, share screen.
There you go.
There we go. All right. Everybody got it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so very much.
You know?
Through the wonders of technology, which have given me an ulcer this morning, and thank you very much, Rabbi, for sleuthing this and your fast footwork. I would like to welcome people from near and far. We've got people from County Kent in Southeast England, Karina Jackson. We've got Gansa Mishpoka of my family from Florida, Ingrid and Benson. And we've got our own family here in Cleveland participating. Hello, Yehuda, who's sitting right there by the computer. So let's move on here. This is a presentation I've wanted to do for years called Did the Exodus Really Happen? And Does It Really Matter? Well, the Exodus is probably the most single important event in Tanakh. It's mentioned in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It mentions the enslavement of the Israelites after the arising of a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, our liberation under the leadership of Moses, the revelation at Mount Sinai, the protection of the Israelites until their arrival at the entrance to Canaan. It's mentioned prominently and repeatedly in Jewish liturgy and prayers, and of course, it's the basis for the celebration of Pesach. But did it really happen? So, for those of us a certain age, I remembered seeing that as a 6-year-old kid and thought that was really neat. So, in the world, there are those who say it did happen. These are biblical literalists, both Jewish and Christian, in whom this is an article of faith because all of Torah was given directly by God and must be true. But for non-literalists, the Exodus has a very long-standing history in the writings of the Jewish people. Since it's got such a long standing and is so deeply embedded, there has to be at least some solid historical basis for it. Now, for example, the Song of the Sea is thought linguistically to be one of the oldest sections of Torah. Also amongst the non-literalists, the absence of archaeological evidence does not disprove that it happened. In other words, the archaeologists love to say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So those who say that it didn't happen, obviously a long-standing question. How can a movement of 2 million individuals with their animals and belongings over 40 years have not left some sort of, shall we say, detritus, to be kind and polite, in its wake? 2 million folks, that's, the 600,000 at Sinai plus the spouses and children, marching 8 across would have stretched in an unbroken line from the Nile to the beginning of Sinai. So that's a huge number of folks. Questions that have been raised by Levantine archaeologists. The traditional timing of the Exodus does not correlate with the rule of Ramses II or the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, which we of course talk about in the Passover Seder. There's no record of the Exodus in Egyptian historical records or that of any other military powers in the region. The archaeologic evidence in Canaan does not support the abrupt change from a Canaanite culture to one which was Israelite. So that might support the idea of having an in situ, in other words, right there in Canaan, birth of the Israelite people in the hills of Judea. Dating of the destruction layers in the places cited in the book of Joshua just does not seem to correlate with the biblical account. So, 430 years of servitude in Egypt. Well, let's look at the historical record. There was rule in the lower Egypt, in other words, closest to the Mediterranean Sea, by the Hyksos, who were not Egyptians. They were Semites. Over Israel, it was eventually overthrown by an Egyptian pharaoh from the south, followed by extensive military activity in the Levantine. Egypt ruled over the Levantine from that point on until the end of the late Bronze Age, so they were the dominant force. Egyptian historical records show that the Egyptians initiated forced labor, conscription amongst all inhabitants of the Levantine, including Israelites. Perhaps the servitude under the Egyptians was also in Canaan, rather than only in Egypt. So maybe that got incorporated into the corporate memory of the Israelite nation. Once the Egyptians were gone, the Israelite leaders wanted to distinguish their nation from that of their Egyptian previous conquerors, as well as those of surrounding people. So let's look at the lack of mention of the Exodus in Moses' farewell. This is towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy. He talks about a lot of things at the end of Deuteronomy that he wants to pass on to the Jewish people, to the Israelite nation. You would think that this summation of his life would at least mention the Exodus, but it doesn't. Seems a bit odd, don't you think? And for Karina, I put this thing on the right lower screen saying, bit weird, isn't it? A Britishism. I'm now going to take you through the documentary hypothesis of the Who Wrote the Bible. This is something that is controversial, was controversial a couple centuries ago, and is controversial now, but let's just use this as a framework upon which we can hang a few concepts. J, E, P, and D, J for Yahwist, the J being J instead of Y because it was German, so Yahwist in German, E, Elohist, P, priestly, D, Deuteronomist, and R, the redactor, the person who kind of put this all together. So again, there is a lot of discussion about the validity of this, but it at least gives you a framework for the discussion that we're about to have. Torah, at least in the view of Richard Elliott Friedman and many other scholars, is a masterful interlacing of the narratives of the 5 books. The authors E, P, and D are felt to have been authored by Levite priests. Interestingly enough, these 3 books are the only ones telling the story of Moses, Pharaoh, and incorporating the plagues. The 4th source, J, shows no evidence of having been written by a Levite priest, at least according to Friedman. It makes no mention of the plagues. It just jumps from Moses saying, "Let my people go," to the story of the event at the shores of the Reed Sea. The Levite authors in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers talk about the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the tent of meeting which held the ark, than any other subject. The non-Levite text, J, doesn't even mention it. So did the Exodus involve the whole nation of Israel, or was it a smaller subset? So right now I'm going to be presenting the thoughts not just of Richard Elliott Friedman, but of a few other things. So what supports this idea that it might have been a smaller subset? Let's look at what are linguistically the oldest parts of Torah. The Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, of course. If you go beyond the opening sentence of it, it mentions the nation of Israel as a whole. It doesn't mention the individual tribes at all. This is from a J source. Later on in Haftarah, in the Song of Deborah in Judges, it contains no mention of the tribe of Levi in Deborah and Barak's victory over the Canaanites. How come? Was it because they did not have any land, or because they were not yet a part of the Israelite nation? There seems to be a disconnect here. So the thought of Friedman and a few other scholars is, were the Levites actually the only ones who made the Exodus from Egypt? Were the references to the Exodus, if the Israelites were actually morphing in situ Canaanites? Interesting thought. The use of the concept of foreignness to accentuate Israelite cultural and religious differences from surrounding cultures, did that seem to come into play? There's a denial of similarities to their Canaanite neighbors to encourage political, social, and religious solidarity. So who are these Levites? Here's Friedman's modest proposal, probably the best written and most concise of all of them. The Levites were a Semitic Canaanite tribe, possibly related to those who remained in Canaan, who settled in Egypt for a while. They were successful in Egypt, but made to feel unwelcome by the new regime that kicked out the Asiatic Hyksos who had ruled over Lower Egypt. The Levites maybe had a tradition of worship of Yahweh, which put them at odds with the Egyptian polytheism of the day. And maybe they migrated to Canaan because of a sense of kinship with those that were already there. So points to ponder. What's in a name? Specifically, El versus Yahweh. Earliest evidence that we have, Song of the Sea and Song of Deborah. Who wrote the actual Exodus story in Torah? Which of the four authors? The Mishkan and the Ramses II battle tent, the similarities in their construction and details. The Ark of the Covenant details given and similarities to Egyptian processionary barks. The rite of circumcision, parallels with the traditions of ancient Egypt, plagues written in the Exodus, the idea of being kind to slave and being kind to aliens. So, what's in a name? Only Levites in the Torah have Egyptian names: Moshe, Hophni, Hur, Pinchas, Merari, Mushi, Pashtur, and plus the midwives Shiphrah and Puah. These names are all seen in ancient Egyptian culture, not just in Torah. The name Moshe, which all of us have been taught, because I drew him out of the water, just happens to be a lucky coincidence linguistically from the Hebrew word masha, the word root, which just happens to mean to draw out. Is this a lucky biblical pun? The redactor of the book of Exodus, Shemot, is trying to make a case that Moshe is a Hebrew name, not Egyptian. But there's no such justification for any of the other Egyptian names in Torah. So Song of the Sea, we have it in liturgy all the time. Probably the oldest text in the Torah based on linguistic analysis. It's a poem, it's not prose, which of course is perfect for oral transmission, which is one of the reasons we think it's one of the oldest things in Tanakh. There's no mention of the number of those who experienced the crossing of the Red Sea, large versus small. The word Israel does not appear in the text at all. The text actually says, leads them to his holy abode, plants them in Legacy's mountain at the Lord's sanctuary, etc. All places where only Levites are allowed to go as Levitical priests and such. It doesn't mention Canaan at all. Moving on to Haftarah. The second oldest text in the Torah, based on linguistic analysis, is the Song of Deborah. Written about the 12th to 13th century BCE, the tribes united to defeat the king of Hazor. The 10 tribes are named, but that of Levi is not named. Why? Are they not yet in Canaan? As a priestly group, were they not involved militarily? Were they given deferments for military service? Or were they not mentioned because they were already dispersed amongst the other tribes doing their teaching duties? So let's look at who wrote the Exodus story, recalling the basics of the hypothesis here of documentary. J, Yahweh's name, is known in the J narrative ever since the earliest narratives of creation. In E, Yahweh's name is not known as such until the time of Moses. Same in P and D. E, P, and D, at least according to most scholars seem to have been written by Levitical priests, whereas the individual who redacted J probably was not. E, P, and D contain long bodies of religious law and commandments. The J narrative does not. So J, according to Friedman, was probably written by somebody living in the kingdom of Judah and was not likely of a priestly family. E, P, and probably D were written by somebody with a priestly background. So let's go to the analogy of the tabernacle and Ramses' battle tent. The graphic that I show you here shows the battle tent, and I think you can probably see my little pointer here showing a graphic of the battle tent. The descriptions of the architecture of the tabernacle and courtyard matches the battle tent of Ramses II, for which we actually have archaeologic evidence right here in this tableau that I have beneath. The ark has similarities to an Egyptian processionary bark. Barks, while they're boat-shaped and symbolically are supposed to float, were actually rarely set in water. They were used in processions functioning as sacred ritual objects. They were sometimes pretty darned ornate, gold-plated and adorned with wings, cherubs, birds, and other things. They were usually carried by priests, Egyptian priests, and sometimes served as a throne or as a footstool. What this here on the right is a pretty good example from a funerary setting, actually taken from a royal tomb. Is this a model that the Israelites ended up adapting? Okay, circumcision. Only the Levite authors emphasize that males have to be circumcised. Circumcision was actually an Egyptian practice. The Levite authors write of God commanding Abraham to make circumcision in the sign of the covenant, and they also include the commandment for all males of Israel to do so. But it's interesting that J source does not command it. It doesn't even mention it at all. Connections with the Egyptian culture are there, but only amongst the Levites. And as you can see here in this stone relief that's actually from an Egyptian archaeological site, ouch, that hurts. Circumcision on adult males, I can only imagine. Parallels with the Egyptian tradition. All are mentioned by Levitical authors, but not by J. Contemporary Egyptian writings and traditions include tales of turning an inanimate object into a reptile, conversion of water into blood, a spell of several days of darkness, parting of waters, death by drowning, death of the firstborn, and many others as well. Does this suggest an Egyptian inspiration of the plagues? So, who knows? In the Levitical sources, E, P, and D, you learn of the 10 plagues, competitions with the Egyptian sorcerers, which was semi-successful, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and Egypt's final capitulation. But if you read only the J or Yahweh's narrative, it jumps from let my people go directly to Pharaoh saying, I won't let Israel leave, then to he heard that the people had fled. So just for those of us of a certain age.
Let my people go.
Slaves are mine. Their lives are mine. All that they own is mine. I do not know your God, nor will I let Israel go.
Who are you to make their lives bitter in hard bondage? Men shall be ruled by law, not by the will of other men.
Who is this God that I should let the people go?
Aaron, cast down my staff before Pharaoh, that he may see the power of God. In this you shall know that the Lord is God.
Nothing of his will harm us.
The power of your God is a cheap magician's trick. Janice.
See?
The serpent swallows up the others.
Pretty cool, huh? Cecil B. DeMille really got it right. Point number 9 here, be kind to slaves. So we talk about this in liturgy all the time. We talk about, well, to aliens, but in Tanakh, we also have references to slaves. Only the Levite sources, EP and D, have laws on how to treat slaves. In each of them, it gives slaves rights and forbids their mistreatment. Why? Because you were a slave in the land of Egypt. There's no laws about slaves mentioned at all in the non-Levitical source J. In the J version of the 10 Commandments does not include slaves. In the J narrative, it's unclear how the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites. J, however, refers to taskmasters, killing of male babies, and refusing the request to leave Egypt, but absolutely no mention of slavery. Be kind to aliens. Levite authors are also the ones who explicitly insist that Israel must not mistreat aliens, foreign residents, sojourners. The first occurrence of the word Torah in the Torah in Exodus 12 says you shall have one Torah, one teaching, if you will, for the citizen and the alien. Levite sources beat it into our heads about 50 more times, and several times tell us why. Because we were aliens in Egypt. We know how it feels. The non-Levite source does not command this. This most explicit revelation occurs in all of the Levite sources, but not in J. And by the way, a picture of new American citizens. They are no longer aliens. They are one of us. Certain politicians need to hear that. So let's do the math. 8 out of 10 Israelites with Egyptian names in Torah are Levites. Both accounts of the revelation of God's name in the burning bush are from Levite sources. Descriptions of the similarity between the Mishkan and Ramses battle tent are in Levite sources only. The similarity between the Ark and Egyptian processionary barks. All 7 items of Egyptian lore and tradition occur only in Levite sources. All 11 references to circumcision in the legal context are in Levitical sources only, 2 of which involve Moses or Levites themselves. All 3 sources that tell the story of the plagues are Levite sources, not J. All texts discussing slavery are Levite sources. All 52 references to aliens are in Levite sources. And all 52 references to the Mikdash, the tabernacle, identified as tabernacle or temple, a place where only Levites would actually be allowed to have access. So, evidence that the Levites left at the supposed time of the Exodus. I mentioned before the Song of Deborah. Deborah did not mention the tribes of Levi. Were they not there yet? Were they dispersed? Who knows? So why did the other tribes accept the Levites if they, in fact, were the only tribe that left Egypt? Friedman has an interesting take on this. He says they were really bad dudes, as you can see here on the right. 4 biblical texts connect them to violent acts. Levi was one of the brothers who massacred the city Shechem for the violation of his sister Dinah. Levi is also cursed for his general tendency to violence. The Levites slaughtered the people associated with the golden calf incident following Moses' command to put them to the swords. The Levites willingly obliged. The end of the Torah, the very final part in Deuteronomy 33, God is asked to pierce Levi's adversaries' hips and those who hate him so they won't get up. Somewhat violent language. So, as Friedman likes to say, he said, you don't mess with the Levites. So, what did the Levites get? They got the priesthood, which included a few priestly cities, as mentioned in the book of Joshua, plus a tithe, 10% of Israel's produce. Hey, not a bad deal. I'd love to have that gig. Also, they have the responsibility of teaching Torah to the Israelite people. They'll teach your judgments to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. Leviticus 10:11 commands that they are to teach what God spoke through Moses. So, how did the story of the Levites become nationalized? How did it get to apply to all of the Israelite nation? How did it internalize? When the Levites taught Torah, they taught that the tradition they brought out of Egypt. Eventually, every Israelite child learned We were slaves in the land of Egypt, and God brought us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Words from the Haggadah. We are going to say it here in a few days. We all came to say that we were slaves in the land of Egypt and that it was a collective experience of all Israelites, not just the Levites. So how do you think that might happen? Well, let's take a look at a Thanksgiving analogy in our own country. American cultural tradition of Thanksgiving, which we celebrate, even though most US citizens are not descended from Pilgrims or Native Americans. So we see the Puritans there, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, et cetera, at the first Thanksgiving. Well, we now know that the historical reality of the relations between the Pilgrims and the Indians was not really all that great for the long haul, and the Puritans themselves were not although they were persecuted for practicing their faith, the Puritans were not particularly tolerant of others. So we still have this kind of, dare I say, sugar-coated notion of Thanksgiving. Well, could it be that the history of the exodus of the Levite tribes just made its way to Israelite culture as a whole? So what else did the Levites teach? The Levites worshiped Yahweh while in Egypt, while the Israelite tribes worshiped the god El. And we still find that, of course, in our own liturgy today. Once the Levites arrived, and as they were incorporated, according to Friedman, into the Israelite nation, the tribes needed to decide who they're supposed to worship, Yahweh or El. They could have decided to worship both. They could have developed a mythology in which Yahweh was the son of El or El was the son of Yahweh, just as the pagans did in Canaan when they said Baal was the son of El. Alternatively, they could worship only El or only Yahweh. But instead, the tribes decided that they were the same one God by a different name. Is this thought supported by the Torah, by the text itself? Two of the Levite authored sources, specifically E and P, develop this point that God was known as El until the time of the Exodus, and then God revealed to Moses that his true personal name was Yahweh. El and Yahweh were one and the same. The author of J calls God Yahweh from the earliest beginning of the J narrative in the earliest parts of Genesis. So, what is the real answer? It really, really is difficult. It is tough. But I wanted to at least put a third option out there. Is the Exodus story a pious fraud, totally made up, as some would say? Did it really happen as it was told, as literalists say? Or was there a third option that allows us to have a little bit of each? In any event, why is it important today? Because the story is a powerful one. It's inspired many over the breadth of history, and not just the Jewish people. Today, as we face the uncertainties of the COVID-19 plague, it serves in some way as a source of inspiration and hope for all of us in tough times. So with that, I will take any questions. Do we have any questions?
Dennis, a question, and you probably did say it, but what is the earliest point in time that we have the gist of the Exodus narrative that we have now, that all the Israelite people left Egypt?
Well, Rabbi Mori, please chime in on this, but what I found is that it's basically at the time that when all of Torah was redacted together as one unit. And you've got a lot of discussion over when that happened. Was it pre-Babylonian exile or post-Babylonian exile? Rabbi, what do you think? Rabbi? Rabbi, are you there? Rabbi, are you there? Okay, is anybody else there?
Yeah, you obviously can hear me because you heard my question. This is Craig.
Yeah, okay, well, would somebody else unmute themselves, please?
I
And
unmute myself. You hear me?
I'm here, Dennis. This is Janice Whitmer's house. So I'm here
okay,
at the very beginning, but came into it.
okay, so what I have here is a question as to when did we, as a people, start to accept the thought of all of us being involved in this? And I did research this, and it seems to be whenever Torah was redacted as a whole, the 5 books of Moses were put together. And the question of that is, of course, an open one. Did that happen pre-exile or post-exile to Babylon? And Rabbi Morey, if you'd please chime in on that, I'd appreciate it.
I'm guessing he lost. He's not, I don't see his picture there anymore when he was on there before. So, and my camera's not working for some reason.
Yeah. Okay.
It's when I look at the participants list, Temple Anshe Hesed host is muted and the video's off.
It's muted
Right.
and the video is off.
Right, and his video was on before, so I think.
Or maybe we lost him. So, I mean, we'll try to proceed with what we've got. There is a body of knowledge, a body of scholarship that suggests the Torah was actually redacted in the final days of the southern kingdom of Judah. But for many, many years, the prevailing opinion was that it was actually redacted post-Babylonian exile. So for what it's worth, that's all I can tell you. All right, anybody else? Anybody else?
No.
Okay, Craig, you brought up an interesting question to me the other day, specifically from Midrash Rabbah. Could you chime in on that?
Yes, it actually talks about another parallel Exodus story that ends up getting meshed in with the Exodus story that we know. And that is an Ephraimite Exodus story. And the Midrashic story, that, as it goes, is that the Ephraimites miscalculated the 400 years of slavery. And so they got all worked up and wanted to leave Egypt about 30 years before the Exodus that later happens. And so they left as a single tribe, went to Philistia and did battle with the Philistines and got slaughtered. And their bodies just littered the roads in the Philistine lands. The survivors schlepped back to Egypt and stayed there and took part in the rest of the Exodus. So when did this story come up, and why did it come up? It's discussed to a great extent in Midrash and in Talmud. At that time, which is 200 years, CE, so around 200, 400, around that time. From what I could find, earlier than that, at the time of the writing of Chronicles, it says that in that, I guess, is around 300 BCE, around that time, that both parallel stories existed. The Ephraimite Exodus and the Exodus as we know it existed at that time. So that was, both of those were common traditions at that time. If there's any earlier existence of that Ephraimite Exodus, I haven't been able to find anything.
Yeah, well, I did some additional looking up at things, at your request, and basically I found exactly what you did. So the version that we've been telling every year in the Haggadah, and if you look at things for Haggadah is, post-Talmudic. So relatively late in our history of the telling of Exodus. So what we have here is a relatively distilled version of the whole Exodus story. But when you actually go back further and further, what is it? Not only that, a point that I didn't really want to develop today, but we should get into it anyway, is that Passover is actually the melding of two holidays. You have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and you have the Feast of Pesach. So these were two separate things that eventually got into one. Was the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which was one day before Pesach, actually something that predated the Exodus experience by a lot, and that it just happened to be there, and then we tacked on Pesach onto the end of it, so that way we had matzah as part of it. Craig, have you found anything about that?
No, but I would say that, that certainly makes perfect sense. When you just look at our Passover celebration, it's wonderful to look at the evolution of that. I mean, we see in Torah, what is it? The three things: the bitter herbs, the wine, and the unleavened bread. And then as we go through the centuries, more and more gets added until we have the Seder that we have now with all the parts of it, all the traditions and everything. And it's just wonderful to see that evolution over the centuries, how much gets added and becomes a part of it.
It is. And this is one of the reasons why when you sit down and to talk to Christian families about this, that there's this feeling that, when Jesus of Nazareth was about to be crucified, that the Last Supper was a Seder. But the Seder, as we know it today, did not really start until about 200 or 300 or 400 years after Jesus was crucified. So just a thought there for everybody. Okay, are there any other questions out there about this particular thing? Because I know this was a real run on landscaping, a real run on theories of origins of the Exodus, and that you're going to find a zillion things written about it. About 5 years ago, a conservative rabbi actually published in a sermon in front of his own congregation in Los Angeles, and I'm surprised they didn't tar and feather him and run him out of town on a rail, but he said that the Exodus didn't happen, QED, period. Have a nice day. So about 2 years later, Richard Elliott Friedman and some other textual scholars, in conjunction with some archaeologists, some very well-known, I'm not talking about just fluff archaeologists, I'm talking about real scholars, said that no, we can't put it together with the real narrative, but there's something there when you get to textual analysis, and then you're putting it together with the archaeologic things, that there was some kind of transition in the hills of Canaan that took about 200 or 300 years. So you have some Canaanite sites that went from pork bones being in the garbage pits to no pork bones being buried in the garbage pits, with an intermediate stage of some pork bones buried in the garbage pits. So clearly something there. Anybody else?
Dr. Vidmar, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
And for people who don't have video, this is Carly. Touching on what you said about how Christians refer to the Last Supper as a Seder. I know that the tradition of a Seder, as we know it, is something that developed, hundreds of years after that. But I'm kind of at a loss of what to say when, Christian friends or Christian coworkers, like when they, I've pointed out to them, like, well, it's not really like a Seder is how Jews celebrate it. And they've asked me, like, well, what was it then? And I'm kind of at a loss of where to go from there.
Okay, well, when you think about it, the pilgrimage holidays, the 3 pilgrimage holidays, which of course are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, okay? So in the New Testament, it's written by the gospel writers, they talk about, Jesus of Nazareth going up to Jerusalem for the feast, and the feast, of course, being Passover. So you had just huge throngs of people coming into Jerusalem for the purposes of the holiday. Okay? So everybody would get together just as we do today, Christian or otherwise, or Jewish or otherwise, for a meal with your family and friends.
Okay.
So this was a meeting of Jesus and his most devoted, most loyal, his most loyal folks, of course. Anybody else? Okay, I see my wife wants to talk. She has a question.
Wait, what?
Yeah, you're listed as live here.
No, I didn't. I just unmuted before and didn't remute it.
Okay.
But hi.
Right. Okay, for everybody else out there. Okay, so these are lessons that a lot of us adults don't really talk about. The origins of Pesach and whatever. You can look at it two ways. If we're looking into more complex backgrounds, and does it really ruin your day? Does it really ruin the meaning of Passover to know that maybe not all 12 tribes were involved in this, like the 10 Commandments movie with Carlton Heston from 1956? To me, it doesn't. It's still very, very important. If anybody understand what Mitzrayim means in Hebrew? And I don't mean Egypt. Think of where the word comes from. Anybody got any ideas on that? Yehuda, you may know that one. Okay, well, sur, rock, okay. Mitzur, from rock or between rocks. So when you're between rocks, you're in a real tough place. So Mitzrayim, yep, Egypt was in a really tough place. And so when we left Mitzrayim, we were leaving because it was a really tough place. So today, we each have in our own lives, or as a Jewish community, or as a community of humanity of all faiths, we have our tough times. We have our Mitzrayims. And, COVID-19 just being the most recent on the horizon here for us. So, it's certainly worth considering. Rabbi, you're back. Thank you.
Appropriate backdrop there.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the one I used.
I was dealing with Gesher, so we were. And welcome,
Okay.
Rabbi Bush.
Oh, yeah, fine. I mean, he should be on here too. I gave him an invite. Anyhow, Rabbi, a question came up, and, I gave him my feeling about it, but obviously you know a lot more about this. Is that when did we as a Jewish people start to have this integrated version of all 12 tribes having made the Exodus? And I just figured, well, it was about the time Torah was finally redacted, whether this was pre-exilic or post-exilic, who knows? But it goes back to that time. Do you have any additional take on that?
Well, it depends on which historical narrative you'd like to sort of adapt, right, or adopt. I mean, part of it is, one way of looking at the text is as a whole. In other words, here's the text and the tradition that we have, and the text says that everybody left Egypt at the same time, although we know that there were lots of people, or at least a number of people, who actually stayed behind. So it wasn't as if the entire Israelite community actually left. The vast majority, did. At least according to the text, we still have people who remain behind. So that's one narrative. The other narrative is that, of course, it was a smaller group of people that left, and that were tribes that sort of got lost somewhere, along the way, and they didn't all kind of make their way. If you want the documentary hypothesis, it's that it's a way of unifying the national narrative of the time, so that the priests, when they're kind of trying to create their legitimacy, they retroject themselves back into the text and say that because today we have representation of all the 12 tribes, at least during that priestly time, then it would be that, of course, that all of those tribes actually came into the land of Israel at that time also. And so they retroject themselves back into the Exodus story.
Well, that was kind of the theme of what I presented, that, or at least Richard Elliott Friedman's theory of the Levites being the guys who actually decided to leave Egypt at XYZ time, and that they eventually made their way back and integrated themselves into the pre-existing Israelite tribes in the hills of Judea, and that their thought of their exodus became everybody's exodus took over.
Right.
For what it's worth. Are there any other questions there? Because I know I presented a whole lot in a short period of time. One of the things I want to know is, did the videos of Charlton Heston come through okay, complete with sound?
Yes, they did. I actually enjoyed them. Thanks for including that. Added some fun to it.
Yeah, that's some fun and brings back childhood memories. I was a terrified 6-year-old kid sitting in a theater in Cleveland watching this stuff. Okay. Any other thoughts?
No.
All right, well, anyhow, I guess we can close out this session. Our next adult ed session will be the final Sunday of the month of April. Rabbi Roger Klein from Tifereth Israel will be talking about why Torah now? And obviously a quintessential question, why is it relevant today? Why is it just as relevant and maybe more relevant today than it has been for the past few centuries? So look forward to that, and we will really try to get this Zoom stuff straightened out so that next time around, we're not going to be fighting with Zoom changing the rules on us midstream.
Danny?
Love it.
Danny?
Oh, Rabbi.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sorry I was late to the session, got distracted and everything else, but I did want to throw out as to the fundamental question, did the Exodus really happen? Alan Cooper, who was, I believe, Rabbi Moraes and both of our Bible 1, Bible 2 teacher, who's maybe not as well known as being one of the people in Shana Na at Woodstock. He said, it doesn't matter whether it's true or false, it's my story. And that kind of works for me.
It's my story and we're sticking with it.
That's it.
To use a Bushism.
That's it.
The value of the story is not in its historical reality, but in its messages, right? So
exactly,
whether or not the Exodus happened makes no difference as to the message and the meaning of Passover.
Exactly.
And what I tell folks, I've had some questions from my Muslim residents actually about this, is that I tell them, the Passover message, it's not just for Jews, it's for everybody. This is universal. It speaks to every Homo sapiens on the planet Earth.
That's why I'm so strong in the spirituals.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
And certainly this year, we are all fighting our way through this little Egypt. And so we're looking forward to that, the sea splitting and being able to walk to freedom.
Amen. Hey, Chag Pesach Sameach, everybody, and Shavua Tov.
Okay, Shavua Tov.
Peace.
Okay, everybody. So as they say, as Cooper would say when he was on Shana Na, actually it was Bowser, Grease for peace.
That's the word.
Thank
Okay,
you, Dennis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dennis.
Okay, bye.
Bye now.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I see what the witch wants.